So to introduce our speaker, I have to say it's odd to eat a big lunch before the topic that we're about to approach today. And it's also interesting to think about China in a different light from what we hear in the headlines every day. I think next week we'll all be obsessed with, is it going to be 7.5% growth in China this year or 7.3%? But obviously there are some other issues going on in China, and a chance to look back into some recent history, really, when you think about it. So today, the hidden story of the Great Famine in China under Mao. Dr. Zhou has been an assistant research professor at the School of Humanities here at the University of Hong Kong. She's just finished her first book, which on this subject, she's written several books, which took her 4 years to research in China. I asked her how she felt when she was conducting this research, and she said, it was revelatory at the end to know everything that she'd learned, but very depressing day by day as she learned what had happened in China and all the talk that was never mentioned about it in all the years that she was there. So after she finishes her time at the University of Hong Kong, she'll be heading to the UK. She'll be teaching at the University of Essex. So we're very lucky to have her here with us before she goes. She'll talk a little bit about her book and her research, and then we'll leave some time for questions and answers. Dr. Zhou?
Thank you, Tara, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming today. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about my research in the past few years. So from 2006 to 2010, I worked on a project of key importance to the history of the 20th century, namely the Great Famine in China under Mao Zedong. It was the direct result of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's campaign to lead China into a communist utopia. Mao believed that a socialist system of agriculture, or the people's commune, would boost agricultural productivity, stimulate rural markets for industrial products, and divert sufficient workers and funds towards the acceleration of China's industrialization. In the race with the Soviet Union, for those of you who are familiar, in 1957, Soviet Union claimed that they would overtake United States in the steel output. So in the same year, in November, Mao boasted that China will overtake the United Kingdom in steel production within 15 years. And by then, China would turn into an industrial powerhouse. But like all utopian projects of the 20th century, the Great Leap Forward was doomed to fail. It resulted in a devastating famine throughout China between 1958 and 1962. It was the worst famine in modern history, claiming more than 45 million lives, with countless individuals being deliberately starved to death or beaten to death. It also led to the mass destruction of agriculture, industrial trade, and infiltrated into every aspect of human life, leaving large part of the Chinese countryside scarred forever by man-made environmental disasters. The Great Famine not only caused a huge loss of life, it has also left long-term consequences. To a large extent, in the countryside, the destructive consequences of the Great Famine are still felt today in everyday life. For instance, if you turn on Chinese television, you see social unrest, the great fear of robbery and corruption all the time. If you turn on television, this is sort of the news headlines associated with China. But those sort of issues were widespread in the time of the famine. However, unlike the Holocaust or other major human catastrophe in the 20th century, There is no place in China's collective public memory for this horrific episode in Chinese history. The history of the Great Famine has long been obscured by official taboos and restricted access to primary sources. Until very recently, very little essential archival material on the subject was available for public access. A new regulation introduced in the 1990s theoretically made available documents older than 30 years to historians and the general public. In practice, however, this is not always the case. Even to this day, a great number of documents are still classified as unsuitable for public access. Thus, the Great Famine remains a dark episode in Chinese history, and it is very much hidden and forgotten. There is no mention of it in any history textbook in China, and it is written off from the official communist historiography. The accepted term in China for this period is the 3 difficult years or 3 years of natural disaster, when we know it's not a natural disaster, it's clearly man-made disaster. So my work, I am one of the only handful of historians who are actually pioneering the history of People's Republic of China through the use of new oral and archival evidence. Born and grew up in China under Mao, several members of my family died in the Great Famine. So as a historian, I was determined to uncover this horrific past of China. I began working on the Great Famine project in 2006. For the next 4 years, I traveled across China to interview famine survivors and to read as much archival documents as possible. So in these 4 years, I pored over thousands of party archives and interviewed more than 100 famine survivors. In my own experience, although in most archives, famine is still seen as off-limits subjects, and there are more or less a fair amount of open documents which can shed crucial light on the period. For those of you who has worked in China or are familiar with China, you probably know in China the word no does not mean no. There is another way to get the things you wanted. So one of the tactics, and this is just to give you an example, one of the tactics I used was I walked into archive. Instead of saying, oh, I want to look at the Great Famine documents, they will never give it to me. I say things like, oh, I want to research on grain procurement in the 1950s and 60s. And many of the archivists have been quite new. They have no idea what grain procurement is. So they look at me, they say, oh, go have a look at the catalog. If you can find the things you want, order them. So that worked. And quite often, for the first couple of days, I would order things which is very banal and terribly boring to read. But after the 2 days, once they got familiar with my face, then they don't keep a close eye on me. So then I start ordering the stuff I really want to look, then they don't really check anymore. So I get trolleys and trolleys of things. And sometimes, even when the trolley arrives, and somebody said, oh, you can't read this is, closed. Then the thing with archives, they change shifts. So when next shift's coming on, I say things like, oh, I haven't finished that file on that trolley. Can I have another look? And the person who come on duty has no idea, so they give me that file. So it worked. So through perseverance over years, I was able to access party archives that nobody, at least to my knowledge, has been able to see, this including historians from People's Republic of China. By painstaking work in small and large archives throughout China, I was able to piece together from hundreds of fragmented documents a fuller story of the famine. As mentioned earlier, agricultural collectivization was an essential component in Mao's pursuit of utopia paradise. After the Chinese Communist Party consolidated its power in the early 50s, it rapidly began enforcing collectivization in the countryside. This is despite the bloodshed and the catastrophic results of collectivization in the Soviet Union initiated by Joseph Stalin, which, as some of you are aware, led to the devastating famine in Ukraine in the 1930s. In China, the pace of collectivization was astonishing. By 1956, virtually all agricultural households in rural China had been organized into collectives. Although the initial stage of collectivization in 1955 and 1956 in the Chinese countryside did not end up in bloodshed like in the Soviet Union, dissatisfaction and unrest, however, was widespread amongst the peasant population. As I learned in the archive, villagers from various parts of China protested regularly outside the government offices in Beijing opposing collectivization. Faced with these warning signs, however, Mao showed no hesitation. He wanted to go further to launch the Great Leap Forward. Two famous campaigns was launched in this period in the summer 1957, the anti-rightist campaign, and in the rural countryside, the socialist education campaign. They were Mao's tactic to silence any opposition voices. A few months later, after launching these two campaigns, in the spring of 1958, the full force of Great Leap Forward was unleashed. People's communes were officially inaugurated in August that year, and by the end of the year, according to an official estimate, nearly 99% of the peasants' population had joined the commune. The general image projected then and later is that the entire country was united in rapturous enthusiasm for the Great Leap Forward, and that by the end of 1958, steel, coal, and industrial output had been massively boosted, while the production of grain and cotton had also increased considerably. It looked as if the communist dream was on the verge of becoming a reality in the Chinese countryside. You see the image here projected, it's rather like the image we have now about the China's economic miracle. But the reality was very different. For the majority of China's rural population then, the Great Leap Forward was an unmitigated disaster. The party collectivized everything. Villagers lost their home, their land, their livelihood, and their personal belongings, from pots to pans that was smelted into, iron pots, but also grandma's needles and even baby's diapers. Some of the archive documents I came across showed that villagers were even deprived of clothes or padded jacket in the winter to keep warm. The reason being because the very unrealistic government's cotton collection quotas, the local cadre, when they were unable to meet those quotas, the local cadre forced villagers to hand over their coats and the winter jackets so they can, take out the cotton to make up the figure. Even worse, in the archives, I also learned that terror and violence was the very foundation of the Great Leap Forward, and the radical collectivization in China turned out to be as bloody and violent as it had been in the Soviet Union. Unable to meet the ever-increasing government agricultural and steel production quotas, local cadres used violence to whip up their workforce. Beating, prolonged physical torture, and food deprivation were the most common methods used. Millions were deliberately starved to death. In many ways, we can see the people's communal in China was worse than the Gulag. In some places, villagers were forced by cadres to strip off their clothing in the freezing winter and to work nakedly. So the logic is because it's so cold, they have to keep warm, so they have to work really hard. Many times, villagers also had their ears or fingers being chopped off because they were seen not working hard enough or they disobeyed the cadres. In some places, people were even buried alive. As I learned in the archives, that during the Great Famine, between 2 to 3 million people were tortured to death or being killed deliberately. We're not talking about people starved to death. These were people being tortured to death or killed deliberately, 2 to 3 million. Famine in the Chinese countryside broke out as early as spring 1958. The top leadership in Beijing was well aware of the problem, but it simply turned a blind eye to them. At the same time, anyone who spoke the truth was purged as a rightist. To give you an example, when I was researching Yunnan province, I learned that in January 1958, the Yunnan provincial government engaged 90% of the local rural population in Great Leap Forward water conservation projects. The goal was to fully irrigate more than 10 million hectares of land in Yunnan within 1 year. Villagers were forced to work day and night, sometimes all day long without a break, with very little food to eat. In February, a major outbreak of edema was reported at Luliang County's Xichong Reservoir construction site, and a huge number of people died. The local cadres who reported the incident was denounced as undermining the Great Leap Forward. After that, no one dared to reveal the truth. The situation quickly worsened. A major famine broke out and the death toll rose sharply. Soon edema and death became widespread, but anyone who dared to report a problem was purged as rightist. So by August 15, 1958, this was at the height of the Great Leap Forward. It was in August when People's Commune were inaugurated and a party conference. But it was also this time, some 170,000 cases of edema was reported in Luliang County and in the nearby county, and nearly 24,000 people had died. The government did nothing. The Great Leap Forward marched forward, and the famine was to spread across the entire country. And a few months later, after what happened in Luliang, in March 1959, at the Communist Party meeting in Shanghai, Mao told top party leaders to be relentless towards the peasants and to procure a third of total amount of crops being produced. In order not to retard the Great Leap Forward, Mao was quite willing to sacrifice half of China's population. These were his very words. He said, to distribute resources evenly will only ruin the Great Leap Forward. When there is not enough to eat, people starve to death. So it is better to let half of the people die so that the other half can eat their fill. To let half of the people die. Human life is cheap in communist China. So by the winter of 1959, chronic scarcity was felt everywhere in China's countryside. Very few places were spared of devastation. Entire villages were wiped out. Whole families perished. Large swaths of countryside fell silent. So eerie to imagine Chinese countryside was so silent, there was no sound. These were the survivors I interviewed told me it was so silent, there was no sound, and the air smelled of rotten from dead human flesh. Dead human flesh were lying everywhere because there was nobody to bury them. So After everything, consumable was eaten up by starving villagers, the only thing left was dead human flesh. Even rats were starving at the time, I was told. So to survive, a number of people resorted to eating dead human flesh, and cannibalism became widespread across the country. In one small region in Gansu province in northwest of China, 50 cases of cannibalism were reported within few months in 1959. And similar incidents were also reported in eastern Sichuan and in Guizhou province. However, the government and local cadres tried to dismiss cannibalism as rumors. In Guizhou, for example, in a very small county in the west of Guizhou called Chishui, when the local police reported to the local party boss that there's a problem of cannibalism, he turned into great fear and accusing the police for making a big thing undermining the Great Leap Forward. So nobody dared to say anything afterwards. Very depressing so far, but on a more encouraging note, one thing I also learned while researching in the Chinese archive is that despite or perhaps because of the suffering, there was considerable resistance to and protest about collectivization and its consequences. Villagers in rural China used what James Scott called weapons of the weak in resisting the Great Leap Forward. They wrote letters of complaints to government officers. They turned to popular religions which had been officially banned by the communist government, and they rallied a huge number of protests. One document I read in one archive moved me to tears. It contained a 1960 memorandum of the Communist Party's Central Committee. According to this document, a poor peasant girl from Henan province's Xinyang region wrote a letter to Chairman Mao, complaining about the injustice done by the local cadres to her father and sister. Afraid of persecution, she stitched the letter inside her jacket for over a year. So here, this new book, just published by Yale University Press, The Great Famine in China, 1958-1962, a documentary history. And this is a labor of my research in the past few years. The book draws on a wide variety of official reports from all over China, and most of them are unknown previously. They therefore represent an important record of what went on in the Great Famine. Furthermore, since 2009, majority of the documents included in this book have been deemed closed file by the archives again. And I remember, after I went back to Guangdong Provincial Archive, many of the files is being removed from the catalog. They're not there anymore. And more recently, an edict from the State Archive Administration in China technically banned any academic researchers from reading archival documents from the period of 1949 to 1979. So no researchers can read anything. They're all sensitive. So in other words, majority of documents included in this book have become inaccessible. So this book may be the only historical records of what happened at the time of the Great Famine for the years to come. I believe the over 100 documents included in this book, all being translated into English, will transform our understanding of what really happened on the ground during the period of the Great Famine in Mao's China. By reading these documents yourself, you will get a better view of how and why the catastrophe unfolded, as well as enormity and the sheer horror of what took place. So in a similar way as the world came to learn the truth of the mass murder of Polish nationals by the Soviet secret police in the 1940s, followed the revelation of the original execution order signed by Stalin, which was revealed in the 90s. So by reading these original documents included in this book, relating to the famine in Mao's China, the world can learn what happened is really beyond any doubt. And these revelations therefore remove any further opportunity for denials of what happened or attempts to defend the Great Leap Forward or arguments for defending an innocent party leadership at the time. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to entertain any questions if you have any.
Dr. Zhou, thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions. There's a microphone around, so do raise your hand, give us your name and your organization if you're with one. I'll try to get to everyone, but we will finish at 2, and I think Dr. Zhou will be around for a while after to ask and take any further questions. Let's start with Robin over here.
Hi, congratulations on a terrific work of research. Many of us are very pleased to see it.
Thank you.
I had 3 specific questions, though. First, you mentioned that there were 2 to 3 million people who were tortured during this period, and I wondered exactly why and who tortured them, local officials, some outside force, or who?
Local officials in the People's Commune.
In their local commune?
Yes, yeah.
Interesting. And what did they torture them for? What was it that the people did? Protest or?
Well, the main reason is to make them work harder. So anybody who was seen not working hard enough was tortured or beaten. Tortured, beaten. Or anybody who said, because there was lots of program went on at the time, like clothes planting. They moved, all the crops into one pot of land, and that sort of thing. So if somebody said, "Oh, this, it's not right. It doesn't work like that," then that person will be purged as well.
And I know of reports from Jasper Becker and others of cannibalism, but I hadn't seen reports of people eating dead flesh. Did you find both, or just the reports of people eating people who had already died? And then lastly, why do you think Mao did this exactly?
With cannibalism, it's mostly, people eating dead human flesh, but there were occasionally, in this book, you will see there were examples of actually, children or other people being killed, and then they were consumed by, that person, the killer. Sorry? Why did that happen? Because there was...
Why exactly did Mao do this, even though he knew that people were starving? Was it just that to get his narrow policy, the Great Leap Forward, to promote it, or was there some larger...
He was a fanatic. Yeah, he believed in this utopia project, and it doesn't really matter the cost. Human life is in China. Some of the documents, I came across by other leaders, the top leaders in China, and they said, during the Civil War period, in order, to defeat the enemy, many lives was sacrificed. So this is another revolution. So few people died. So what?
Yeah. We have 2 questions on the veranda back.
I'm Göran Leonhufvud, freelance writer. I'm curious about your book in relation to Frank de Kutter's recently published book. Are you working basically with the same kind of party archive material?
Well, Frank de Kutter is a very close colleague of mine. We worked very closely on this project. We collaborated on this project. You will see, actually, I mentioned it in the beginning of my book. So we shared, China is a huge country, you have to go. I mean, to cover so many sort of archives, it's very difficult task for one person. So we divided it up. So, like if Frank has been to that archive, I don't go to the archive, I go to some others. And, being Chinese, some of the archives, it's easier for me to access than for him. So we actually shared, what all the information we uncovered. So we worked very closely together.
That seems very reasonable, and we should all be grateful for that. But do you publish more of the whole documents?
Yes, yeah. My book is all documents, and I really think it's really important for the world to see those documents. As I said in the last bit of my talk, it helps to remove all the doubt and everything, and also to reinforce the evidence presented, and to take it much further, the evidence presented by Frank Dikötter. Yeah.
Over here.
Ted Kavoris from Panoramic. I realize China has a collective amnesia to these events, and as you said, that these documents are no longer available. How do you see it playing out? I mean, will China eventually come to terms with what I view as an embarrassment and why they don't acknowledge it? How will it play out eventually that they'll come to terms with this dark part of the history?
Well, how it would turn out, I don't know. My hope is that, Communist Party will one day face it and will, allow platform for discussions on the topic. But we don't really know. If you look what happened in the former Soviet Union in the 90s, the archive were open. It was, like golden era for researchers. Then after that, it's all closed. It's impossible, to access any of the Soviet archives now. So we don't really know what will happen in China.
Over here.
Steve Tennant, a very simple question. You mentioned that the files have actually been removed from the catalog. Does this perhaps mean or suggest that they either have or intend, in fact, to destroy the files, or do you think that they're actually retaining them? In which case, why? If they're that ashamed of what they contain, isn't it easier just to destroy the evidence once and for all?
Well, this is one thing which is very interesting about the Communist Party is they do keep those records, even though they are not open, and they are not allowed public access. But they do them meticulously. Everything is kept. And they sometimes use those kind of things when there's some kind of political campaign or movement going on. The party, they will actually dig up those documents, and if they want to get rid of somebody.
Transcript of our discussions. You could hear somebody. There was my wife, there was me, and there was clearly at least one other person on the line as well when she was staying in the Beijing hotel.
Right, yeah. Well,
We'll go to Francis, and then we have one more time for a question on the veranda.
Francis Moriarty, RTHK. My question flows on from your statement about the meticulousness of keeping the records, because it seems that in the photographic record of China, this period, there's pictures of Great Leap Forward, of metals being smolted, et cetera, smelted, et cetera. But there seems to be very little photographic evidence of this massive period of starvation and inadequate supply of food. One would think that somebody would have kept a record somewhere and that it would have surfaced. Did you run across any evidence of this?
Not in the archives. The files I was able to access, but I know they do exist. For instance, there were photographs of cannibalism took place, taken by police, as they were doing crime investigations. So they had taken photographs. I've seen them, and somebody else showed me, and he was managed to get it earlier, because he started really early, immediately after the regulation was published in the 90s. He was in the Chinese archives, and so he managed to get hold of some of them by all kinds of briberies. But I haven't seen it myself. But I know they do exist. The police file is not accessible.
We have time for one more question on the veranda.
Agneta Engqvist, freelance writer. Figures and...
Could you speak into the microphone?
Yeah, can you hear now? Yeah. Figures and statistics are always a little troublesome in China, and you said that 2-3 millions were deliberately starved to death, and that totally 45 million people died. I mean, are these the figures you found in the archives? And
Yes.
Do you believe them? And do you think could have been even more people? And my second question is, why did you become interested in this subject, this period of China?
So second question is, why did you become interested in it, in this subject? And the first is 2 to 3 million. Is that the figure that you came across?
Yes, yeah. 2 to 3 million were tortured and beaten to death or deliberately killed. Yeah, these were the figure I came across in the archives. Because by 1961, the government sent, if you're familiar with the history, if you have read something about the history of the famine, or you will see in my book, there's an epilogue. So there was, by 1961, some of the leaders, including the then president of China, Liu Shaoqi, when he went back to his hometown, he saw what was going on in the countryside, and he was devastated. So he actually, took the position to Mao and wanted to stop this. Then there was kind of, major dispute broke out between them. But eventually, Liu Shaoqi was able to win the party, support. And so the government actually sent out lots of investigation teams to various parts of China to find out what went on. So those investigation team actually wrote very, very detailed documents of all the things went on. So these were the figures they collected. The second question, why? It's both professional and personal. As I mentioned earlier on, several members of my family actually died in the Great Famine. And the other, the professional reason is I'm a historian of modern China. I've worked from 19th century. I've covered, most of topics before 1949. So it's quite natural sort of to move on from 1949. Also, there was this, as I mentioned, after 90s, the archive opened up for public access. So I saw the opportunity. So, that's why I got into this topic. And so also I mentioned I worked very closely with Frank Decotter. Actually, we knew each other before we started this project. So, we both ticked into this opportunity, yeah.
Well, it's 2 o'clock. We're going to leave it there on that note. Dr. Zhou, thanks very much for coming to speak to us today. And from the club, a small gift.